Stay tuned for tonight's adventure with the Fat Man.
Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are because I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Baltimore Fats, and this is part one of Riot City. Yeah! Oh no! All right, sit back, relax, and enjoy the tale of the rifleman. All right, so this is the story of the rifleman, a fake Civil War story, right? And it's a story that begins not so much by looking at the idea of whether or not the Civil War was faked, which is kind of how the thought started, but more so that it was staged for public consumption, the way modern events like this one are. Who thinks the reporting on this is legit, right? That this thing wasn't staged, right? No one, right? If you're paying attention at all, this thing was as rigged as they come, right? Or if you want to reach back a little bit further to events like these. Think how easily Gen Pop's knowledge about these events was manipulated. Why should the Civil War be any different? What makes what we know today about the Civil War infallible? What do you think people 150, 160 years from now are going to know or think about these events? Right? It's more probable than not that history is going to remember these events in a way that has very little, if anything, to do with the truth of them. If anything, it would have been easier to pull the wool over Gen Pop's eyes 160 years ago than it is today, right? Because there was a vastly smaller media presence in the world then, or so they tell us, right? Making it that much easier to control the flow of information. How much more or less discerning were people in the 1860s versus the people of today about what was good or truthful reporting versus what was bad or misinformation? How would they know? And so after consulting with my resident Baltimore historian and sister from another mother, Mary, I decided to take a closer look at the Pratt Street riots of 1861, known today as the Baltimore Riot of 1861. And it was during this riot that the first blood of the Civil War was shed on the streets of Baltimore, where the street's thirst for blood is never quenched. And so after talking about this for a little bit with Mary, I decided that if there was any funny business going on during this thing, surely I would find it in the trusted reporting of the Baltimore Sun, right? And so let me just set things up a little bit before I dive in. It's Friday, April 19th, 1861, and just the week before, the U.S. Army surrendered Fort Sumner in Charleston, South Carolina, to Confederate forces, signifying the beginning of the Civil War, right? And in response to this, President Lincoln has ordered Union troops, mostly from Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, to travel through Baltimore City on their way to D.C. But there was a big problem, right? The people of Baltimore wanted nothing to do with it. And we've talked a little bit about this in the past. Baltimore was definitely a Confederate stronghold, right? Its most prominent politicians and businessmen were sympathetic to the Confederate cause, right? And they saw Lincoln's order as a threat to their sovereignty, right? So they did everything they could to redirect the soldiers away from Baltimore. They wrote a bunch of letters, they set up roadblocks, they blew up bridges, anything they could think of, right? But to no avail. The soldiers were coming, whether the citizens of Baltimore liked it or not. And so on Friday, April 19th, this powder keg lit by Lincoln exploded into violence and death on the streets of Baltimore. And the Sun reports that most of the action happened along Pratt Street, starting at President Street Station down here, moving across the Inner Harbor, and concluding at Camden Station over here. But the President Street Station still exists, or a part of it anyway, right? And today, it houses the Baltimore Civil War Museum. Because of course it does, right? And it's very interesting that the riot, or the story of the riot anyway, starts at the President Street Station when it was President Lincoln's orders that sent the troops to Baltimore. Right? There's no coding in that at all. And so the troops have arrived at President Street Station, so let's pick it up with the Sun's coverage of the riot on the day after, on April 20th, 1861. Happy 420, everyone, right? And this is the morning edition, so I guess this is the wake and bake edition, right? So I'm guessing that the morning editions hit the streets sometime between 5 and 8 a.m., but that's pure speculation on my part. I'm not really sure. And this is the full front page of the Baltimore Sun. It was a big paper, right? And the best part about the big stories of the day back then is that they provided the reader with a table of contents. If you wanted to read about the railroad barricades or where people were wounded or killed, you could find that information without having to read the whole incredibly lengthy article, right? And so this is how the Baltimore Sun starts their version of the events, by reminding everyone that this didn't come out of nowhere, right? That it had been brewing for some days now. brewing enough days that the Sun can detail that the Union soldiers were to go across town in 31 cars. And so if they know that, I mean, if somebody's sitting there counting the cars, these cars would have had to have been arranged, paid for by someone to be there waiting for these soldiers. I find it difficult to believe that President Street Station just had 31 train cars sitting there waiting for these soldiers, right? And the thing about the train cars back then, at least in Baltimore City, is that they were still drawn by horses. Steam engines weren't running commuter rail downtown in 1861, right? But so the troops, they get on their way in these 31 cars, right? But at the intersection of Gay and Pratt Streets, which is here, right, a vast assemblage had collected. And they were contemplating how to stop the procession. And wouldn't you know it, the road there was being repaired, and paving stones were just lying in heaps.
How convenient.
And these paving stones, these bricks, were seized by the crowd and used for purposes of assault. And I'm sure there was in no way, shape, or form a paid agent provocateur in the crowd to throw the first brick. And so I'm not going to read this whole article here. I'm just going to touch on a few points. Because what I'd really like to stress in this video is the level and alleged accuracy of the reporting of the day's events. Right? The Baltimore Sun has this whole day clocked from 9 a.m. when crowds were gathering at the Camden Street Station to 9 p.m. when a large crowd tried to break into the aforementioned President Street Station to steal rifles and muskets believed to be kept inside, right? And spoiler alert, there were no guns at the President Street Station. Right? So, and the Sun can name just about every man, woman, and child who was injured or killed during this conflict, right? They can name who tended to their wounds or declared them dead, right? They can tell us where they lived, right? Where they were from, right? And in one case, where and when the funeral would be, as in the mysterious case of Robert W. Davis, Esquire. And unbelievably, the Sun can actually name a good many of the Union soldiers from Massachusetts and where they came from. And so reading these accounts in the Sun made me curious about how they were able to get all of these details to press for the next morning's edition, right? This is 1861. I think about the reporting on major events of today, and it could be days, even weeks, before details like these hit the presses. How did they do it? How are they able to condense all of this information, including publishing full, allegedly impromptu speeches, word for word, that were delivered after 4 p.m., as the Sun does in their reporting about the meeting in Monument Square, which commenced shortly after 4 p.m., right? And at this meeting, which was allegedly attended by thousands, important city leaders like the mayor and some others spoke, right? They gave speeches to the crowd, right? And of course, wouldn't you know it, this meeting happens to be taking place right in front of a Masonic hall, right? So there's no collusion or corruption going on here at all, right? Nope. It's just unbelievable. And the Sun was sure to capture every word for those not there to hear them, right? And thankfully, most kept it brief. But this guy, right, this William P. Preston, who came to the meeting as a spectator, yet somehow was asked to speak. And he does, right? He goes on and on to the tune of 8 minutes. That's how long it took me to read his allegedly off-the-cuff remarks out loud, right? And they're amazing. But why print a full 8-minute speech, right? Did the Sun have column room to spare on that day or something, right? Did nothing else happen during the riot that would have been more worthy of reporting than William P. Preston's bloviating, right? It's absolutely crazy, as is the quality of his speech, right? He had this thing ready to go. There's no doubt about it in my mind. It probably took him a couple of days to write and rehearse, right? Because if this thing wasn't rehearsed, then William P. Preston, whom I know nothing about, was a very gifted speaker, right? Who had given these ideas a lot of thought leading up to his speech, right? And so reading this account, it just was boggling my mind. How did they get all this information ready for press, right? So the first thing I kind of wanted to do was sort of think about what the Inner Harbor area was like in 1861. And like today, it's really not all that big, right? It's probably like 2 miles from President Street Station to where Camden Street Station would be. Small enough, I suppose, for a handful of beat writers or pages to run all over town and then report back to the Sun Iron Building, which would have been located here. Making a nifty little triangular pattern here, if you wanted to see it, right? And then, of course, there's also the telegraph, which was essentially rolled out nationwide in the late 1840s. How many of these businesses downtown were set up to send telegrams in the 1860s, either to the Sun or to Western Union, which had offices allegedly near the Sun? I was unable to verify that, but I'm going to take the person I heard it from. I'm going to take their word for it. Right? So, all I'm imagining now is like a row of people sitting at a long desk having to transcribe this insanity. In a big, noisy, open, echoey room, right? It's just unbelievable. It drives me crazy just thinking about it, right? So they had to transcribe all of these dots and dashes by hand, right? Because there were no typewriters in 1861, right? And then these guys had to hand it over to a copy editor who would need to proofread and correct the copy. And then that would need to be approved by the managing editor or whomever, who would then in turn send it off to the typesetters who had to manually typeset the columns, right? Again, I'm struggling to conceptualize how long all of that takes, because this is all before the printing process. How long did that take? And so in a harbinger of what's to come with my publisher's clearinghouse, I wanted to know what kind of printing press the Baltimore Sun was using in 1861, right? So I paid a little visit to my friends at the Maryland Historical Society, and I learned that the Sun was using one of these, right? And this is Richard Hoe's 6-cylinder lightning press. Look at this thing, right? It's massive. It takes 6 people to run, and they're dwarfed by it. Allegedly, this machine was capable of printing 8,000 pages an hour. All right, that's 2 pages a second to you and me. All right, 2 pages just printed, and 2 more, and 2 more, right? And the ink is still wet, right? They have to get these pages off of there to dry so they can then in turn be flipped over so they can do it again, I don't know about you, but all I'm imagining is this. And it gets even better, right? Because though I couldn't find any modern pictures of Hoe's cylinder press, I did find a video of people running the next gen Hoe press, which is considerably smaller but still needs 3 people to run. And it's unbelievable what this guy has to say about how long the typesetting process took. I had to pick my jaw up off the desk after he said this.
If you take a column like this, it would take one man 10 hours to set this column, one column.
10 hours just to set this?
Yes.
That's amazing.
10 hours! 10 hours for a long column. Right? If that were the case, it would take a team of people all night to set a single template. Right? 2 teams, actually, because the Sun was a 4-page paper, right? Each edition needed 2 templates, one for pages 1 and 4, and one for pages 2 and 3. And so now I know that each edition didn't need all new templates for every edition, right? Because we have to remember that advertisements and personals and banners and things like this, these things were set. Because we have to keep in mind that the Sun, like all the major newspapers of the day, were printing multiple extras a day, right? If something happened after the morning edition, say around 9 or 10 a.m., they could swap out a story, slip a new one in its place, and then all of a sudden it's extra, read all about it, right? A new edition could hit the streets by midday if they hustled. And this observation brings up an interesting thing to me about these old newspapers and their archives, right? Because this one says morning edition, but not all of them are as clearly marked. How do we know what editions are being archived? What stories could be missing if they're swapping out stories, right? Not every edition is preserved, right? So this begs the question, how do we know if the editions preserved are even editions that hit the streets? How many individual copies of these old papers exist today? Or are they like the Sun? Digital archives from microfilm taken like in the 1950s or something. Where are the originals? Right? They may exist. I have no idea. But if you wanted to shape an historical narrative, not having any originals around to contradict your now digital archives is a good way to do it. Right? And think how easily a digital archive can be erased or deleted. Just erasing massive swaths of history in a fell swoop. Right? It's crazy. Right? So if it took 10 hours to set a long column like this, as this guy suggests, and he may be blowing smoke up the typesetters' asses, I don't know. But even if it takes half that, you would need to have your copy set no later than midnight or 1 a.m., I'm guessing, if you wanted to make a morning edition, right? And I'm thinking about, the conditions, it's low light, tiniest little typesets, it's crazy. It sure would make getting all of this news together and typesetting and everything a whole lot easier if you had some foreknowledge of what was to come, right? Maybe had a few injuries or deaths lined up and ready to go. Perhaps a business owner or two in on the grift who were paid to smash a window and then point the finger at the Union soldiers, right? It was them Union boys that smashed my window, right? It could be. Because who was going to fact check this shit back then? No one. And so it was with all of this in mind that I took a very keen interest in the reporting in the Monday, April 22nd, 1861 morning edition of the Baltimore Sun, which tells me very early on in a very brief paragraph that at an early hour on Saturday morning, the morning after the riots, right, that the city council was convened in a secret session and made an appropriation of $500,000 for defense of the city. So I read that and I was like, wait a minute, a secret session? Why is it a secret session? How secret could it have been if the Sun is reporting on it on Monday? And so this could be perhaps a fine example of how language can change the meaning of a thing. Today, these types of meetings are called emergency meetings, right? Yet their purpose is often the same, the quick release of public funds. Somewhere along the line, these politicians learned that emergency or special is a much better word than secret, right? Emergency at least has the air of help over profit, right? Yet that's what all of these manufactured crises are for, right? To generate a profit for somebody. And so this secret session and its $500,000, right? And my beliefs in an absolutely corrupt government had my fat senses all a tingle. So I immediately wanted to know, how much money is this really? And so converting it, it's $17.5 million today. This isn't small potatoes or chump change, right? So where did all of this secretly released money go? How did they use it to defend the city, right? If they released these funds on Saturday morning, how did they use them over the weekend? Surely the Monday Sun, who broke the story of the secret session by redefining burying the lead with this tiny one-sentence paragraph, a mention so brief it's scarce to be remembered beneath the mountain of information that follows it, right? And if someone does remember, they'll think that the money will be well spent, right? Because in the Monday Sun, they report that the city has purchased a shit ton of rifles and muskets to arm every unarmed citizen of Baltimore. And they're busy handing them out all day. Because in the very next paragraph, right after the Sun tells us about the secret appropriation of $500,000, they tell us that the people who had been without arms looked more hopeful, right? It was cause and effect. Meeting happens, then the people looked more hopeful, right? Because of the approach of a number of carts towards the marshal's office, which drew thitherward thousands of persons, thousands, eager for the privilege, of assisting in the defense against the threatened invasion. And the arms were 900 of Hall's patent rifles from Mr. Isaac M. Denson. Not Isaac. And so, he had 900 rifles, not enough to, sort of quench the thirst of the thousands, the throng of thousands. Right? He just so happens to have 900 of these Hall's patent rifles lying around.
How convenient.
Right? But thank God for this guy, right? And the amazing thing about this unparalleled act of generosity is that the Sun already reported on it on Saturday, right? In reporting on Friday's riots, they learned that Colonel, right? So we know whose side he was on, right? Anyway, Colonel Isaac M. Denson of the firm Messrs. Denson, and I'm reading this as Beck, but it might as well be back, right? Because I'm getting strong Bacchus vibes from this, right? And I guess they were lawyers by use of the word firm, and their location is really amazing as well, right? But anyway, he tenders his 900 of Hall's patent rifles to the Board of Police Commissioners on Friday, right? The day of the riots. How did he get them there with all of that chaos, with the way the Sun talks about break-ins and robberies by people looking to steal guns, right? Like at President Street Station. These acts of attempted burglary were happening all over the city. How do you get 900 rifles anywhere in the city under this climate? Right? Do you just throw a tarp over your wagon and ride into town slowly, whistling Camptown races under your breath, hoping no one bothers you, right? I'd be shitting bricks that don't melt if I had to carry these guns through town that day. But he got them there somehow, right? So I'm thinking maybe he dropped them off in the pre-dawn hours under the shadow of night. Hell, he could have dropped them off 3 weeks prior, for all we know. Because the only thing that we do know is that the Sun learned of this transaction on Friday, not when the actual transaction took place. And make no mistake about it, this was a transaction. Colonel Isaac tendered his rifles, meaning that he got or was expecting to get paid, which he apparently does by the time the city council's secret meeting is over, because that's when the carts of rifles hit the streets. And the way this story plays out to me just screams some form of premeditation. The colonel and the city council knew every unarmed person in the city was going to want a gun. And it's my speculation that they knew that because people like the colonel, right, and the city council and other Baltimore politicians and moneymen were going to make sure of it. A planned riot would be a great way to siphon who knows how much of the city money into your own pockets. How much of this $500,000, again, $17.5 million today, was actually spent on defense? This is a question that I keep asking myself because in reading and in rereading Saturday's and Monday's Sun articles about this event, the only thing that even remotely comes across as a defense expenditure is this arms deal, right? Everything else is kind of speculative, right? If the city wanted to blow up bridges and cut telegraph lines or set up blockades, like this one, which was allegedly set up in West Baltimore. And I mean, come on, who is this going to stop, really, right? And where is everybody? Did no one want to pose with their handiwork? Because this was work. So I guess if the city council was responsible for paying for this stuff, they would have had to pay somebody to do it. But considering this happens all sort of before the riots, that would lead to some more premeditation aspect of it, right? But the Sun is replete with stories of citizens just grabbing or stealing anything they could get their hands on to build blockades or tear down bridges. So I doubt very much of the city council's appropriated funds was spent on these things, right? So it really does just leave this arms deal. And other arms deals like it, like this one the city made with auctioneer F.W. Bennett of South Charles Street, right? And so since these arms deals were the only clear evidence of city spending that I could find, I wanted to know just how much a Hall's patent rifle cost in 1861. What would it cost for 900 of them? And in searching for that information, the gatekeepers dropped a bomb in my lap, right? The first thing Google gave me in my search is an article about the Hall carbine affair, right? In which J.P. Morgan, in a brilliant stroke of war profiteering, finances the purchase of 5,000 surplus rifles that he pays $350 apiece for, right? And then he sells them back to the government for $22 apiece. That's an 85% markup, right? And this article is implying that he actually bought them from the government, right? This is really amazing. Not the Big Jipper, right? George Peabody's boy, John Pierpont, the Unitarian preacher and Delphian's grandson, right? He wouldn't engage in ruthless war profiteering, would he? And the best part about it is that these rifles were crap. They were more likely to blow the thumb off a rifleman than they were to hit an enemy target. This is the same make and model that Colonel Isaac sells to Baltimore City. And so what this article does is it gives me a value on these rifles, right? Surplus rifles go for $350, right? Or roughly $125 today, right? But this 5,000, that's a bulk purchase, right? So I'm going to be a bit more conservative and put a $5 tab per rifle on 900 of them, or roughly $175 a pop today. And we know Colonel Isaac is military, or at least ex-military anyway, so I think we can get a good sense of where these rifles might have come from. And who's to say that the Big Jipper didn't learn this trick from Isaac? And who's to say that Isaac didn't charge the city $20 or more a pop, or roughly 20 grand? 20 grand is a drop in the bucket of a $500,000 appropriation. Where did the other $480,000 go? And who knows how much they spent on Garrett's auction guns? How much of this money did the Baltimore playmakers whack up amongst themselves? Even if they managed to spend $400,000, which again I think is highly unlikely given the value and cost of things in the 1860s. Even if they were to spend $400,000, that would be $14 million today. That would still leave them with $100,000 or $3.5 million today. $100,000 could line a lot of pockets or grease a lot of wheels in 1861. Add in that the Colonel Isaac is also a veteran of the Baltimore City Council, having represented the 15th and 16th districts of Baltimore, and the 15th district will be the future home of Camden Yards, right? The final destination of the Union Soldiers' March or carriage ride through Baltimore. How incredibly coincidental is that, right? Or is this just my apophenia running wild? So if you want to ask me if events of the Civil War could be staged to drive a narrative, I think there's enough smoke around the Baltimore Riot of 1861 to suggest a raging fire underneath, especially when you throw people like the Big Jipper into the mix, right? The story of the U.S. Civil War is not what we've been sold, however far you want to string that out. And believe me, I could string this thing out. To think that the Civil War couldn't have been staged or manipulated, to think otherwise or believe that it's not possible, seems like folly to me. And I do have to stress that this needs a lot more work, right? I'm only working with the 2 main articles that I read, right? The days to follow may actually have more information on where that money could have been spent, but the working speculation is that they didn't spend $500,000. Right? And speaking of follies and staging, I'm going to close this one out with a couple of unbelievable cherries, right? First is that the April 19th date of the riot is one that it shares with an equally infamous and inauspicious Baltimore event, right? And that's the death of Freddie Gray. Freddie Gray dies on April 19th, and his death leads to a riot all its own. A riot started by the throwing of bricks. Those kids were set up, treated like criminals before the first brick was thrown. And I'm sure those bricks were just lying around in heaps because they were fixing the road there, right? You know, this isn't coding in action at all, right? Because these two incidents also coincide with the ancient Roman harvest festival of Cerealia, which may have begun on the 19th of April. May have, right? Like they don't know. And of course, the Cerealia was a week-long party with games and entertainments, right? As well as your fox torture, right? Where they would light foxes' tails on fire and set them loose in the city, right? As punishment, right? For, this is a ritual reenactment of something that happened in very distant times, right? And of course, there was also ritual blood sacrifice happening at the Cerealia. They would sacrifice a sow. And so this reminded me of the story of the first commissioner of agriculture, Isaac Newton, right? And his relationship with Abraham Lincoln, and how I observed that perhaps the Civil War could have been just a blood sacrifice to fertilize the American soil, right? Symbolically, anyway. It just made me think about how all this agricultural shenanigans started within the U.S. government in 1861, right? The same year as the Baltimore Riot, which just so happened to occur on the same date that the Cerealia begins. Another connection the Cerealia brings me to is, of course, Ceres' presence in the Aventine Triad with our boy Liber, Dionysus, Bacchus, right? And the Aventine Triad was founded by our boy Numa Pompilius, whom we know was taking his orders from Diana, right? And in Mud City, the Basilica is a secret temple to Diana, right in the heart of Baltimore, right? Where the Baltimore Riot of 1861 happened, right? And finally, the Cerealia and the Aventine Triad connects us to our old drinking buddy, the Juice, all right? To which I say, only in Mud City. And so to close this one out with one final note about the Baltimore Riot of 1861, the local Confederates won the day, but this guy couldn't afford to have Washington, D.C. surrounded by Confederate states. That just would not do. Right? So he flexed, and Union forces occupied Fort Federal Hill. And Honest Abe had its cannons pointed at the U.S. citizens living in Baltimore to keep them in line for the rest of the war. So not very much time for the city council to spend very much of their appropriated funds for defense. I wonder what they did with it. And in a reminder of what could happen should the citizens of Baltimore City ever defy the federal government again, the cannons on Federal Hill are still pointed at them. All right, so this thing is far from done. It's going to be a trilogy. Remember, guys, just because you don't know the truth doesn't mean you can't have fun with the lies, right? So until the next one, cheers. And the next one starts now.